Unethical leaders tend to create a toxic workplace culture. It really is little wonder that unethical leaders are a problem, since being in business actually calls for a determined, if not ruthless, mindset, the ability to be confident and in control, to be forceful, to be calculating, and a meticulous planner. These are attributes that few people possess, but there's one category of person that has them in abundance: the psychopath. Researcher Robert Hare estimates that 1% of the general population fits the profile for psychopathy, though the percentage of senior managers might be 4 or 5 times that figure. Oxford University psychologist Kevin Dutton surveyed 5,400 people across a wide range of professions, and he compiled a list of the top 10 jobs ranking highest for psychopathy. Top of the list, chief executive, followed by lawyer, media personality, salesman, and surgeon. Now, while psychopaths are more likely than others to commit crimes, most of them, and this has to be stressed, most manage to live successful lives without harming others, their psychopathic personality helping them along the way because they've got it under control. Problem is, though, it's the psychopathic boss who makes the culture and sets the tone for the way some organizations go about their business. So it's these so-called grey zone skaters that are the problem. Is your boss someone who likes to operate ethically, or do they skate around in that grey zone between what's ethical and what's legal? Or worse, do they like to cross over the line into illegality if the risks are low and the benefits outweigh the liability? Those that work for people like that, for such a boss, can sometimes get so caught up in this whole atmosphere and not wanting to upset the boss, they develop a case of ethical blindness. These folks are not usually conscious of being unethical. It's simply that management has created an environment in which ethics are not much considered, and this allows otherwise decent people to become established in that unethical behavior. So if you put an otherwise good person into a toxic environment, perhaps one that's been created by a psychopathic boss, and that person will find it quite difficult, maybe very difficult, to resist the slide into ethical blindness and harmful behavior that goes along with that. So what do you watch out for? Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who's best known for his Stanford prison experiment, came up with a set of social processes that, in his words, expedite evil. Reading these or hearing about them is a reminder, really, for how we are all perched at the top of our own slippery slope. First factor is mindlessly taking the first small step. It's easy when there's something to be gained and little to lose to do this. It's the thin edge of the wedge that creates a forward momentum. In business, you might be expected to cut a few corners as an acceptable part of getting the job done. And as time goes by, the practice moves beyond asking, is this the right thing to do, to, can I get away with it? This is a transition that is easily made in a culture of ethical blindness. Secondly is dehumanization of others. When the tribal mindset of us and them leads us to see outsiders as being less than human, subhuman. They're outsiders, we don't know them, we don't like them, they're probably enemies, we may have to kill them. It'll be helpful to think of them as being subhuman, it'll be easier to do the necessary. Now, if that sounds a little dramatic, I'm really just talking about what we instinctively still carry around with us deep inside, this tribal us and them mentality. You only have to look at the blood-soaked history of warfare to see the destructive potential of this kind of thinking. When a boss tells everyone that this is war, that we must smash the opposition or the competition or bury them, well, they're creating a hostile environment in which survival is linked to killing the enemy. Next, we have the de-individuation of self. In other words, anonymity. People who mask their identity are more likely to behave in antisocial ways because anonymity gives them permission to behave badly. If a worker is an anonymous cog in a machine-like organization, they're just a small part of a big machine, they feel less than human themselves, and so they feel less governed by human decency. Next, we have diffusion of personal responsibility. Becoming swept up in a mob mentality, for example, a lynch mob, and get caught up in it, and you're capable of almost anything. Thousands of usually law-abiding Londoners became looters and arsonists during the 2011 riots because everyone else was doing it, in inverted commas. That's the excuse that many of them gave after they were arrested. So a workplace with the a kind of the end justifies the means culture makes it quite easy for people to do what everyone else is doing. Then we have blind obedience to authority. When an authority figure like the boss orders you to do something, it's very difficult to refuse, particularly if not complying carries serious consequences, like getting fired. But in the evolutionary past, such disobedience to the leader could be fatal, and was often fatal. Then there's uncritical conformity to group norms. Norms are standards of behaviour, and they exert a powerful influence over our behaviour, particularly if disobedience or being a nonconformist will get you fired. Again, in the evolutionary past, social exclusion was usually fatal. You didn't do what was expected. You got expelled from the group and left to fend for yourself, and that usually meant dying. And finally, there's passive tolerance of evil through inaction or indifference. British political philosopher Edmund Burke noted that, quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. You don't need to be a perpetrator, it's enough to simply stand passively by." So where does this leave you? Well, if you're working in an organization with a less than ethical culture, one thing that is left open to you, apart from leaving that organization in the most graceful way that you can, is to practice a form of bottom-up leadership. So you can still establish yourself as an ethical person in your own sphere of influence, provided the boss is not outright diabolical. This is a kind of bottom-up leadership that sets a good example for others to follow. And when enough other people with their spheres of influence overlap, the culture can change. In the end, though, your best option may be to look for another job and to get out gracefully, but don't underestimate the power of collective action to create an ethical workplace.